Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 7, Declarations of War. Count Berchtold had ordered the ultimatum to be presented to Serbia at 6 o'clock in the evening of Thursday, July 23. Originally it had been 5 o'clock, but Berchtold delayed delivery for 1 hour in order to make sure that President Poincaré and the French Prime Minister Viviani should have actually left St. Petersburg on their journey home. The German Chancellor and Foreign Secretary did not see the text till the afternoon before. They were startled by its character, but nevertheless did not recall or alter the German circulate note, already dispatched to guide their ambassadors in London, Paris and St. Petersburg, declaring that the Austrian demands were moderate and proper. The ultimatum required compliance by Serbia within 48 hours. Whole libraries have been written upon the next 8 days, and their chronicle is far beyond the limits of this book, which can but notice the salient points. The many sincere efforts made by statesmen and ambassadors to keep control of the situation, the desperate resistance of the Tsar to war, the 11th hour repentance or awakening of the Kaiser, the paroxysms into which the cabinets of the parliamentary countries were thrown, the despairing agitations of the socialists in every land, counted as nothing compared to the mechanical processes of mobilization and the outbursts of national fervors and excitement. The Austrian ultimatum had fired the train which led to a mine loaded by the vice and virtue of half a century. The flame ate remorselessly along the fuse. Europe was thrown at once into convulsion. In a dozen capitals, the leading political, diplomatic, military, and editorial personages felt themselves at once in the presence of danger. The rasping terms, the humiliating conditions, the parade of mortal hatred could have no other meaning than war. It did not seem possible that any state, however small, however in jeopardy, could make the necessary abject acceptance. When, on the Friday afternoon of July 24, the British cabinet assembled to discuss the Irish quarrel, then at a pitch, heard Sir Edward Grey read the text of Berchtold's document, nearly every one felt that we had entered a new world. I remember that we had to go abruptly to the House of Commons to vote in a routine division. Behind the Speaker's chair I met my great friend and political opponent, Mr. F.E. Smith, afterwards Lord Birkenhead. We had been trying to reach some party reconciliation about Ireland, and he asked me anxiously whether I had any news to impart. I said, "None of this matters now. In a week all Europe will probably be at war." After voting I went back to the Admiralty and reviewed the naval situation with Prince Louis of Battenberg, the First Sea Lord. There was very little to be done. At no moment in 100 years was the navy more conveniently disposed. It was in fact actually undergoing a test mobilization and assembled in its entirety for the review. Out of 525 war vessels under our direction, there were only 5 large ships in dockyard hands in any part of the globe. All the rest could proceed to their war stations without a moment's delay. However, on Saturday the reserve men, who were required for the oldest and weakest ships, would be going back to their homes, and on Monday the whole battle fleet assembled at Portland would separate for exercises, training ashore, or leave. Every hour or day of dispersal would require about the same time for reassembly. The First Fleet, comprising practically all our modern strength, was permanently upon a war footing. We decided that, as everything was completely in our control within the time bracket, we need not take any alarmist action. We could afford for 48 hours to go on with the dispersal of the fleet as if nothing had happened. After all, no one had the right to assume that because Austria wished to chastise Serbia, all the greatest nations and empires would go mad. They might, but they might not. Sunday morning, July 26, showed that Serbia had submitted. Her leaders understood only too well that argument or protest would be answered by cannon. But then, during the day, it was learned that the Serbian obeisance was not acceptable to the Austro-Hungarian government. There were, it appeared, some reservations. The Austrian minister, Baron Giesel, had quitted Belgrade, and the invasion of Serbia by Austria was imminent. Serbia, under no illusions, had mobilized at the same time she bowed. By Sunday night, excited crowds filled the streets of St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Berlin. Or the Sunday newspapers published evening editions in triple-leaded type. Reports that the German Navy was mobilizing came in from many quarters, official and unofficial. We continued to allow the reservists to go to their homes, but we held the First Fleet together at Portland and kept all the Second Fleet ships lying alongside the quays where their balance crews lived and trained. Near midnight, after consultation with Sir Edward Grey, I published this fact in the newspapers. This exceptional procedure was intended by the Foreign Office to intimate to all who might be concerned that the British Empire was not detached from the European situation. Footnote: a fuller account of the British naval precautions may be read in The World Crisis, Volume 1. End of footnote. Difficulties had been expected in obtaining the Emperor's signature to the declaration of war against Serbia. When Margutti handed the necessary document to Count Parr, the Count remarked, "This may be all right, but all I can say is that men of 84 years of age don't sign war proclamations." Count Berchtold had therefore fortified himself by laying before his master at the same time a report that the Serbians had already fired upon Austrian troop steamers on the Danube and that hostilities had in fact begun. The text submitted to Francis Joseph ended with the words, "The more so as Serbian troops have already attacked a detachment of imperial and royal troops at Temescubin." This was not true, and Berchtold, after the emperor had signed the declaration, erased the sentence, explaining the next day that the report was unconfirmed. But he did not give the emperor any chance to review the decision. His policy was perfectly clear. He meant at all costs, by hook or by crook, to declare war on Serbia. In the whole world, that was the only thing that counted with him. That was what Germany had urged, that he must have. And that he got. But he got much more too. The Serbian reply had been handed to Giesel in Belgrade at 6 p.m. on Saturday, the 25th. Its submissive character was known all over the world on Sunday morning. Its actual text was not officially telegraphed. It reached London, Paris, and Berlin by post early on Monday the 27th. The Serbian minister in Berlin gave it to the German Foreign Office in the morning, and about noon it was handed to Herr von Jagow. All this is certain. The Kaiser had returned to Germany from his cruise in the Norwegian fjords on the night of the 26th in a very warlike mood. The intemperate minutes which he had scribbled upon the telegrams received at sea convict him of this. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 27th, he held a conference of his executive officers of state and war. The Chancellor was there and the chiefs of staff. Jagow was there, but he had not brought the Serbian reply with him. The emperor was told verbally that it agreed on nearly all the points, including the punishment of the officers. He was not told in such a way as to make any decided impression upon him in the general stress. The conference concerned itself with military measures and precautions and separated in a spirit of resolve to fight the business through, cost what it may. Die Sache, koste es was es wolle, durchzufechten. This at least was the information conveyed to Falkenhayn, not himself present at the meeting. Jago returned to Berlin and during the evening received Monsieur Jules Cambon, the French ambassador, who asked him about the Serbian answer. He said that he had not yet had time to read it. Nearly 48 hours had already passed since it had been rendered in Belgrade. During the evening of the 27th, the Wilhelmstrasse completed their arduous task of making a fair copy of the document for the Kaiser. This was sent off by special messenger at 9:30 p.m. to the palace at Potsdam, 18 miles away. Incredible as it may seem, the Kaiser, as we are assured on all hands, did not read it until late in the morning of the 28th. When he did so, he was staggered. In fact, he was completely capsized. Already since his return he was beginning to be uneasy at the attitude of England. He was relieved and delighted at the Serbian submission. He wrote in the margin of the dispatch, "A brilliant performance for a time limit of only 48 hours. This is more than one could have expected. A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it every reason for war is removed and Giesel ought to have remained quietly in Belgrade. On the strength of this I should never have ordered mobilization." Wilhelm II now thought he had gained what he wanted most of all, a great diplomatic triumph without a shot fired. Once again the Tsar would be rebuffed. Once again the Austrian alliance would have been cemented by faithful German support. This time, at least, his reputation in German military circles for firmness could be under no reproach. Regicide Serbia would be chastened in due course with the acquiescence of the powers. There need be no war. He expressed himself ready to negotiate on the basis of a temporary Austrian occupation of Belgrade. He wrote at once to Jago, "I am convinced that, on the whole, the wishes of the Danube monarchy have been acceded to. The few reservations that Serbia makes in regard to individual points can, in my opinion, well be cleared up by negotiations." But it contains the announcement urbi et urbi of a capitulation of the most humiliating kind, and with it every reason for war is removed. If these words had been written 12 hours earlier, they would certainly have stopped the war. But now they were too late. At 11 o'clock on this same morning, Tuesday the 28th, almost while the Kaiser was writing his minute and congratulating himself that the danger was past, Count Berchtold telegraphed to Belgrade that the Royal Serbian government, not having answered in a satisfactory manner the note of July 23, 1914, presented by the Austro-Hungarian minister at Belgrade, Austria-Hungary consequently considered herself henceforward in a state of war with Serbia. There can be no doubt that the German Chancellor and Foreign Minister, led up to a certain point by the Kaiser, had made up their minds to bring about a state of war between Austria and Serbia, with the intention of confronting the powers of the Triple Entente with an issue on which they must fight or fall apart. They believed, and also no doubt sincerely hoped, that their rivals would choose the latter alternative. They had braced themselves, however, for the worst contingencies. They knew the impulsive character of the emperor. They knew of his fear of war. They did not intend to give him the opportunity of backsliding at the critical moment. Hence the routine formality and inexplicable delays at Berlin, hence the decision, speed, and energy at Vienna. But there must have been some special art practiced to keep the text of the Serbian reply from the Kaiser till the sense had run out. It is on this point that William II should speak. He was by no means supine in the transaction of business. On the contrary, he discharged his duties with punctilio and superabundant energy. Now, if ever, was the moment in his reign when these qualities were required. This, of all of the innumerable documents he had dealt with in his reign, was the one which deserved them. How was it that the contents of the box delivered by messenger at Potsdam on the night of the 27th did not meet his eye till a further fatal 12 hours had passed? Confidential secretaries, personal aides-de-camp, court officials, someone must have been pressed into the service of the Wilhelmstrasse. Was the Kaiser a victim of the same manipulation which, in different forms, was applied to both his brother autocrats in Russia and Austria? The searchlights of post-war inquiry, which have lighted more brightly the events of this week than any period in history, should be directed to this dark and carefully shaded spot. The facts remain that the Serbian reply was not read by the men on whose decision the fate of the world still hung, until nearly 60 hours after it had been delivered at Belgrade, and that before he could act upon it, the irrevocable declaration of war had gone forth from Vienna. The Austrian declaration of war upon Serbia ended the first phase of the outbreak of Armageddon. The griefs and hatreds of these two countries against each other could now obtain satisfaction by arms. The second phase was the dispute between Germany and Russia about the mobilization of their armies. The first quarrel was petty but real. The second measureless but technical. Until the Austrian cannon bombarded Belgrade, the control of German policy lay with the Kaiser and his ministers. Once fighting had begun even in this obscure corner of Europe, the German and Russian general staffs predominated. Military reasons cut across and ruptured every diplomatic situation. Moltke and Falkenhayn towered above Bethmann-Hollweg and Jago, just as the warlike Grand Dukes and generals at St. Petersburg took charge of the Tsar. Henceforward, the prescribed war plans of the German and Russian empires and the execution of the successive stages of their mobilizations became the overpowering theme in both countries. Kaiser and Tsar alike felt themselves morally gripped by firm seconds who led them remorselessly to the dueling ground, cautioned them against betraying weakness or nervousness on the field of honor, handed them the pistols and gave the signal to fire upon each other to their mutual destruction. This second phase occupied 4 days. It ended at 6 p.m. on August the 1st, when Germany declared war upon Russia. During this period, immense efforts led by Sir Edward Grey were made to retrieve the situation. Nearly all the ambassadors in all the great capitals strove earnestly for peace. As this movement developed a spontaneous force, it affected both Bethmann-Hollweg and Jago. When it became increasingly plain to them from the reports of the German ambassador in London that a general war would find the British Empire ranged with France and Russia, both lent themselves to action which a few days earlier would have dispersed the crisis. The Kaiser, now desperately shaken by the imminence of the explosion, and the Tsar, sincerely clinging to peace, interchanged a series of personal telegrams unique in the story of nations. But neither they, nor their ministers, nor all that Grey might do, could regain control of the purely technical measures and countermeasures which the chiefs of armies demanded and took. The first war between Austria and Serbia was about a murder. The second war, which absorbed it, was a war between Germany and Russia about precautions. The third and greatest of all wars, beside which the others were but trivial, the war between Germany and France, was merely consequential and happened almost as a matter of form. The German plan for this third war required the invasion of Belgium, and the invasion of Belgium brought the British Empire united to the field. Nothing in human power could break the fatal chain, once it had begun to unroll. A situation had been created where hundreds of officials had only to do their prescribed duty to their respective countries to wreck the world. They did their duty. War having broken out on the Danube, various levers of precaution or preparation were pressed throughout Europe. At 5 o'clock we ordered the whole British First Fleet, comprising our 38 best capital ships, to its northern war station at Scapa Flow. It left Portland at 7 a.m. on the morning of the 29th, passed the Straits of Dover during darkness with all precautions, and by midday on the 30th was safely through the narrow seas and in blue water. This movement, which was kept secret till accomplished from all except the Prime Minister, was in no way provocative. The fleet was actually steaming farther away from Germany. Nobody could object to that, but it made us quite secure whatever might come. We were in the fortunate position that the one essential step which our own safety required, while it increased our diplomatic influence, did not endanger the immediate safety of others. Up till this stage it had not been certain that Germany and Austria would gain not another bloodless victory, such as had rewarded Ehrenthal 5 years before. But on this occasion Germany found herself almost immediately in the presence of a somber fatalism in the intent powers. There was a feeling in Paris and London that Germany meant to have war and meant to have it now. If she did not, it was easy to find half a dozen solutions. Grey, indefatigable, proposed a conference of the powers and begged all parties to be reasonable. France abstained from every form of provocation. But there the British and French governments came quite definitely to the end of their resources. If Germany intended war, nothing could stop her. If she was bent on so directing events that the long-threatened, long-dreaded hour must strike, then she would have her way. There could not, for instance, be any questions of France begging Russia to give in for the sake of peace, or of Great Britain telling France or Russia that they would certainly be left alone if they choose to fight. The two great Western powers felt that if Germany would relieve them of all responsibility and would of her own initiative and at her own moment bring successively Russia, France and Great Britain into one united front against her, they could not help it. They must face whatever was coming to them. Believing themselves about to become the objects of deliberate aggression, and seeing their all-powerful opponent putting himself hopelessly in the wrong, the one thing they would not do was to repudiate each other. To do this might avert the war for the time being. It would leave each of them to face the next crisis alone. They did not dare to separate. They awaited with bated breath but stern hearts the further steps that Germany might choose to take. The scene must now be shifted to St. Petersburg. We have seen how nicely Berchtold had timed his ultimatum so as to make sure that President Poincaré should have sailed before news of it arrived in Russia. Monsieur Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, had however a premonition. Instead of going to bed after the leave-taking, he drove to the Foreign Office, where he learned that a most important dispatch from Vienna was being deciphered. It was the ultimatum. The next morning found Russia and Austria face to face. The deepest feelings of the Slav race were aroused. The wounds of the Bosnian crisis 5 years before still ached. The visit of the French president, gone but yesterday, gave confidence. Russian society, military and political, was gathered in the capital, and large numbers of notables thronged the court at Tsarskoye Selo. Nevertheless, the decisions of the Ministerial Council held on the 24th were studiously restrained. No military steps were taken, but the Minister of War was authorized to prepare in case of necessity orders for a partial mobilization against Austria. A manifesto was published declaring that Russia could not remain indifferent to the fate of Serbia, and Vienna was earnestly asked to extend the time limit of 48 hours to enable discussion to proceed. The German ambassador, still pourtalais of the Bosnia crisis, informed Sazonov that Austro-Hungary could not accept interference in her differences with Serbia, and Germany also, on her side, could not accept a suggestion which would be contrary to the dignity of her ally as a great power. Sazonov rejoined, "We shall not leave Serbia alone in her struggle against Austria." The next day arrived the Austrian refusal to extend the time limit. On this, the Tsar, presiding over his Council of State, ordered immediate proclamation of a preparatory state, corresponding to Germany's drohende Kriegsgefahr, threatening danger of war, and to our own precautionary period, and of martial law in fortresses and on the frontier. He also authorized his foreign minister to issue, when he deemed it necessary, the orders already in preparation for partial mobilization against Austria. But now occurred one of those technical difficulties of which statesmen should be better informed beforehand. The Russian General Staff was horrified at the form of partial mobilization sanctioned by their government. They exclaimed that it would derange their plans for general mobilization if, as they believed, war with Germany as well as with Austria should ensue. Even against Austria alone, the southern districts would provide 13 corps only, instead of the 16 their war plans required. In particular, the mobilization of the Warsaw region, not hitherto ordered, must be included in any coherent precautions against Austria. They complained vehemently that the partial mobilization which had been approved was a political measure which bore no relation to military requirements. It would confuse their railway movements and be deeply injurious should the supreme danger supervene. General Januszkiewicz shook Sazonov with his solid arguments. He was supported by all the principal staff officers and by the Quartermaster General Danilov. Footnote: the Deputy Chief of the General Staff. End of footnote. It was agreed that 2 ukases should be prepared for the Tsar to sign. One for partial, the other for general mobilization, and that final decision which to use should be held in suspense. On this, Januszkiewicz warned Zieliński, the commander at Warsaw, that July 30 would be announced as the first day of Russian general mobilization. On the expiry of her ultimatum and the departure of Baron Giesel from Belgrade on the evening of July 25, Austria had ordered the mobilization of 8 corps, half the imperial army, against Serbia, with the 28th as the first day of mobilization. Although this measure was aimed solely at Serbia, it affected military districts in the north of the empire, like Prague, from which troops were to move to the Serbian frontier. Thus the Russians had grounds for believing that preparations were also on foot against them. The Austrian declaration of war following these disturbing reports determined Sazonov to act upon the discretion accorded him 3 days before. He therefore sanctioned the partial mobilization and informed the German government, with many disclaimers of any hostile intent towards them, that the Odessa, Kiev, Moscow and Kazan military areas would begin to mobilize on the 29th. Jago had stated on the 27th both to the British and Russian ambassadors in Berlin that if Russia mobilized only in the south, Germany would not mobilize, but if she mobilized in the north or if Russian troops entered Austrian territory, Germany would have to do so too. Thus, Sazonov had not only reason to take precautions against Austria, but the right to believe that these would not involve Germany in countermeasures. Meanwhile, the temperature was rising fast. On the afternoon of the 29th, the news that the Austrian monitors had begun the bombardment of Belgrade roused Russian public and official opinion to fever heat. About the same time, the German ambassador, Pourtalès, informed Sazonov that further continuance of Russia's measures of mobilization would force Germany to mobilize, and that a European war could then scarcely be prevented. The situation of the Russian minister was painful in the extreme. Austria had rejected all his proposals. Germany forbade all pressure upon her ally. Every word of encouragement or comradeship had been studiously avoided by England. The military chiefs, on whom the life of Russia might depend in a few days, were unanswerable in their technical sphere. Germany had retracted her promise to remain impassive if the Russians mobilized only against Austria. The guns were firing on the Danube, and the attack upon Serbia had actually begun. Monsieur de Sazonov resisted the military men no more. There remained only the Tsar. Late on the night of the 28th, the Tsar had sent his personal telegram to the Kaiser. "Am glad you are back. In this most serious moment I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignations in Russia, shared fully by me, is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure brought upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Nicky." On the morning of the 29th, he received a telegram from the Kaiser sent independently a little before his own, saying that the Kaiser fully understood how difficult it was for the Tsar and his government to face the trend of public opinion. Therefore, with regard to the hearty and tender friendship which binds us both from long ago with firm ties, I am exerting my utmost influence to induce the Austrians to deal straightly to arrive at a satisfactory understanding with you. I confidently hope you will help me in my efforts to smooth over difficulties that may still arise. Your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin, Willy. Both these telegrams were in English. They seemed to offer a new hope of peace. But even this intimate tie of the sovereigns, each with his throne and dynasty at stake, could not withstand the hourly increasing strain of the military measures. Sometime during the morning of the 29th, both ukases for mobilization, partial and general, were presented to the Tsar by General Januszkiewicz. It seems probable, though not certain, that after long and strenuous arguments the Tsar signed both. At any rate, Dobrorolski, the chief of mobilization, during the afternoon of the 29th, obtained the signatures of the various high authorities, as prescribed by the Russian constitution, to an order for general mobilization approved by the Tsar. This task was not completed till 8 o'clock, and the general, having cleared the telegraph lines, was about to give the decisive signal when he received a definite order from the Tsar cancelling general mobilization and authorizing only partial mobilization. Nicholas II was still struggling for peace. He had telegraphed again to the Kaiser thanking him for his conciliatory and friendly messages, and ending, "It would be right to give over the Austro-Serbian problem to the Hague Conference. Trust in your wisdom and friendship." At 9:40 p.m. on the 29th, the reply of the Kaiser to the Tsar's first telegram arrived. It suggested that Russia should remain a spectator of the Austro-Serbian conflict, without involving Europe in the most horrible war she ever witnessed. He advocated a direct understanding between the Russian and Austrian governments and promised to promote it. Although this was no concession at all by Germany on the main issue, it had affected Nicholas II sufficiently to induce him to countermand the general mobilization. He even tried to stop the partial mobilization, but both Sazonov and Januszkiewicz convinced him that this was impossible. At 1:20 a.m. he replied to the Kaiser, "Thank you heartily for your quick answer. The military measures which have now come into force were decided 5 days ago for reasons of defense on account of Austria's preparations. I hope from all my heart that these measures won't in any way interfere with your part as mediator, which I greatly value. We need your strong pressure on Austria to come to an understanding with us." None of these internal Russian perturbations were apparent to Berlin. The German General Staff had full and punctual information of most of what was being done in the various Russian military districts. Although the formal order even for partial mobilization was not dispatched till midnight on the 29th, the commanders concerned, warned informally by the General Staff in their professional zeal and lively expectation of war, were already making all kinds of preparations in anticipation of the order which they expected momentarily to receive. All such preparations were reported to Berlin. They involved, for instance, the Warsaw area, as well as the southern commands of which Germany had been officially informed by the Russian government. Since the 29th, Moltke had urged the sending of an ultimatum to Russia, and Falkenhayn had demanded the proclamation of drohende Kriegsgefahr. When, on the 30th, the Russian formal announcement of the partial mobilization was received, the Kaiser agreed to this. Threatening danger of war was proclaimed. This measure was virtually equivalent to the first 2 days of general mobilization. That is to say, it set in motion a vast number of processes that would in any case have been taken upon a decree of general mobilization. It must not be supposed, however, that the military commanders throughout Germany had remained inert during the last 3 or 4 days. Like their Russian counterparts, each wished to be forward in every preparation, and all the military centers were humming with activity. Reports of all this, carried back to Russia, decided Sazonov and the military authorities that general mobilization could be delayed no longer. By any immense concerted effort they prevailed upon the Tsar at 4 p.m. on July 30 to sign a new ukase of general mobilization, and an hour later all the military centers were so informed. Shortly before noon on July 31, the news of the Russian general mobilization reached Berlin. At 3:30 p.m. an ultimatum was sent to Russia declaring that if Russia did not within 12 hours cease every war measure against us and Austria-Hungary and make to us a definite declaration to that effect, the German mobilization would be ordered. This summons was delivered at midnight on July 31. At 6 p.m. August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. It is strange to reflect that on this very day Sir Edward Grey had at last reached a complete agreement with the German Foreign Office upon a form of direct negotiation between Austria and Russia. The cause of quarrel had disappeared on paper at the same time as the fighting all over Europe began. The British preparations kept apace with these grave developments. At the cabinet on the morning of the 30th, moved by Captain Hankey, footnote, now Sir Maurice Hankey, end of footnote, the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defense, I asked and obtained sanction for the putting into force of the precautionary period, which the War Office ordered at 2:10 p.m. At the same time as this was done, I authorized the Admiralty to send the warning telegram to the fleets. This last had become only a formality. Apart from the recall of the reservists of the Third Fleet ships, all our naval arrangements so far as we could foresee them were complete. The war of Austria upon Serbia about the murder of the Archduke and other grievances had begun. The second war, of far graver character, had broken out between Germany and Russia about the mobilization of the Russian armies against Austria. The Eastern Front was aflame. But now the third and greatest spread of the conflagration must follow. The German General Staff had no fears about Russia at the outset. They could easily have waited for 2 or 3 days before taking any measure against her. All their thoughts were turned on France. Since the war had come, they must attack France without delay. The 6 brigades straining at the lashes beyond the frontier must violate Belgian neutrality and seize Liège from the second day of mobilization. Not a moment could be lost. Accordingly, Germany on July 31 informed France of her ultimatum to Russia and asked the French government to declare within 18 hours whether it intended to remain neutral in a Russo-German war. Belgium was also invited to afford clear passage to the German armies about to invade France. There was of course no quarrel between Germany and France, and a treaty of guarantee between Germany and Belgium. These difficulties had to be surmounted promptly. The German ambassador in Paris was therefore instructed, if contrary to expectation France should declare an intention of remaining neutral, to demand the surrender of the fortresses of Toul and Verdun as the pledge of neutrality. This demand, like asking Great Britain to hand over Portsmouth and Dover, was intended to make sure that there could be no backing out by France. Any such improper behavior on her part would have been most embarrassing to Germany, whose armies had already started. The French Prime Minister, Monsieur Viviani, however, replied forthwith, according to the formula agreed upon in his cabinet, that France would act according to her interests. "You have a treaty of alliance with Russia, have you not?" "Quite so," replied Viviani. Nothing could be more correct and debonair, and the German ambassador was thus relieved from delivering the second and contingent part of his message about Toul and Verdun. Monsieur Viviani escorted his visitor to his car. Nothing more of significance passed between the two countries. Germany declared war on France at 6:45 p.m. on August 3. And the next morning the German vanguards broke into the Duchy of Luxembourg, in contravention of the various treaties which protected it, on their way to march across Belgium to the invasion of France. The Belgian king and people, threatened with instant assault, appealed for aid to Great Britain and France as joint guarantors with Germany of her neutrality. When these events became apparent to the British cabinet and Parliament during August 2 and 3, an ultimatum was sent to Germany forbidding her to violate the Belgian frontiers and requiring her to withdraw at once any troops who might have done so. Answer was required by midnight on the 4th. The answer was a refusal and the continued march of the German armies. At midnight, therefore, by German time on August 4, Great Britain, in full unity with all the dominions and dependencies of the British Empire, declared war upon Germany. It is impossible to recount these events in the light of all we know without once again trying to apportion responsibility. We have described the slow, half-conscious growth of European antagonisms in the quarter-century before the catastrophe. We have seen how the mine was slowly loaded. We are now concerned with the guilt of firing it. After all, it need never have been fired. A war postponed may be a war prevented. The combinations of states vary as years pass. The intents or alliances of one decade may have lost their savor in the next. Time and peace solve many problems, and men's thoughts move on to new spheres. Terrible before the history of 1,000 years is the burden of those who let this blast of misery and devastation loose upon the thoughtless world. We must not allow ourselves to be baffled by the immense volume of knowledge now accessible upon the immediate coming of the war. Everything was being laid bare. The Gouge Temple official documents reveal the whole conduct of Great Britain. Even the German writer Ludwig affirms that there is no substantial discrepancy between these full post-war disclosures and the voluminous Blue Book published within a few months of the beginning of the struggle. The archives of the German, Austrian, and Russian empires have been ruthlessly exposed by revolutionary governments, each anxious to condemn the old regime or at the least unconcerned to protect it. Not only dispatches and telegrams, but office memoranda, the records of informal conversations between diplomatists or military men, the marginal scribblings of the Kaiser, All are now in world-open print. There is no lack of material. Indeed, it is its plethora that obstructs judgment. To read many modern writers, one would suppose that the war came by itself, and that no person in authority ever thought of such a wicked thing. Berchtold did this and Conrad that, and Jago was on his honeymoon, and Churchill was snubbed by the Kaiser, and Bethmann-Hollweg did not understand the situation, and the Russians got excited and Moltke alarmed, and then all of a sudden all the greatest nations in the world fell upon each other with fire and sword. It was a case of spontaneous combustion. The theory that it all happened by itself, that Germany carelessly gave Austria a blank check to correct Serbia, that Russia was indignant at the spectacle, that Germany was alarmed because Russia mobilized, that France and England did not tell Russia she must give in, that England did not tell Germany in time that she would fight, that all Berchtold wanted was his little private war with Serbia, that all Germany wanted was not to be forced to desert her ally, that all the Kaiser wanted was a diplomatic triumph, all these cases find ample documentary support. Still, certain stark facts, which no elaboration can veil, stand forth for all time. Berchtold and his circle meant to use armed violence upon Serbia. The Kaiser encouraged and urged them to do so. Both parties knew that such an event must arouse not only the Tsar and his government, but the Russian nation. Both decided to accept this risk and whatever else it might entail. The Kaiser, having given Berchtold and Vienna a free hand, deliberately absented himself until the ultimatum to Serbia had been dispatched. The German Chancellor and Foreign Secretary instructed their ambassadors to declare that Germany considered the ultimatum right and proper, before they had even seen its terms. When the Serbians returned a soft answer, Jago and others delayed the presentation of this document to the Kaiser until it was too late for him to prevent Austria declaring war upon Serbia. Berchtold issued his declaration of war with precipitate haste and obtained its signature from the Emperor Francis Joseph, partly under false pretenses. Every request for delay was refused by Vienna. Every proposal, whether for conference of the powers or direct negotiations between Austria and Russia, was refused or resisted until too late. At St. Petersburg, the Russian government, court and military men extracted first a partial and then a complete mobilization decree from the reluctant Tsar. Germany fastened upon Russia a deadly quarrel about her mobilization. Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia requiring her to cancel it within 12 hours. At this moment, the German mobilization, although not officially proclaimed, was already in progress. Germany declared war upon Russia. Germany summoned France to repudiate the terms of the Franco-Russian alliance and hand over to German keeping her key fortresses as gages of faithful neutrality. Germany declared war upon France. Germany violated the treaty protecting the Duchy of Luxembourg. Germany violated the neutrality of Belgium. When Belgium resisted, Germany declared war upon Belgium and marched across Belgium to the invasion of France. It was not till then that Great Britain declared war upon Germany, and we are still disinclined to say that she was wrong.